Hi lovelies! Welcome or welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Maria and today's video is going to be my 15 Autobuy authors. Now, believe it or not, it was actually quite difficult to whittle it down to 15 because there are a few authors that I would still say that I probably would buy any book that they bring out, but these are the 15 that I don't even need to read the synopsis. I don't care what the book's about. If they've written it, I'm going to buy it. So that's kind of the ethos I use to try and whittle this down to 15, because otherwise it probably would have been about 50 authors long, which I mean, it's a great thing to have that many authors that you really love their writing, you really trust their writing, that you would basically buy anything that they write. But I tried to keep this list to just the authors that I literally blindly will trust. No matter what they bring out, no matter what they write, I am going to buy it. So you will notice from the list that most of these authors are fantasy authors, and that's purely because I probably read a lot more fantasy than contemporary and romance and things like that, and just because it's my preferred genre. So 9 times out of 10 I'm going to enjoy the book that they bring out because it isn't my favourite genre. But I am definitely starting to branch out a lot more this year, and I'm hoping that by the end of this year I'll have a few more literary fiction or romance authors that I can add to this list that I completely trust their writing and will buy basically anything they bring out. So at the moment I've only got a couple, so I will start with them when we're going through the list, but just wanted to pre-warn that most of this will be fantasy. And the way that I'm going to do this is by going through the first book that I read by them and then my favourite book by them. So this is a trend that I've seen on Bookstagram. I'm not sure if it has translated over to BookTube. Pretty sure there has been other creators that have done this. I haven't personally watched any videos, but I know this isn't my unique kind of idea. So I haven't got inspiration from a booktuber or anything, but I definitely have seen this trend on Bookstagram, and pretty sure I done a post for this on Bookstagram as well. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get into the 15 authors that I blindly trust and are my Autobuy authors. Okay, so as I say, it is mostly fantasy, but I do have one romance author and one kind of literary fiction author. So I'll start with the romance, and the author that I want to highlight is Ashley Poston, and the first book I read by her was The Dead Romantics, and it is also my favourite. It's my favourite book I've read from her. Even though I've really enjoyed the other ones, this is definitely still my favourite, the one that I would usually recommend to most people. I think what I love about Ashley Poston's writing is that yes, it is contemporary romance, but I do always feel like there's a much deeper, heartfelt kind of undercurrent within her writing, and especially with hers there is that little bit of magical realism in there, so maybe that's why I'm drawn to this. It does obviously tie back to my fantasy roots and give me that little bit of whimsy that I love, so I think that's probably why I gravitate towards her writing a lot when it comes to contemporary romance. I do enjoy a few other authors, but in terms of one that I would auto buy, and I will be. I mean, she's got a book coming out this month that I'm definitely going to purchase and definitely going to read. And I decided that before I even read the synopsis, but the synopsis does sound pretty good. But yeah, The Dead Romantics is the first book I read by her. Definitely still my favourite. And this one's about a young woman who is a ghostwriter for a very popular novelist, but she's kind of uninspired at the moment. She's not able to come up with an idea for the latest book that she's supposed to be writing. And essentially at the start of the story, she gets a new agent who she kindly asks if she can have a bit of an extension to help with this mental block that she has. And her agent says no, and this kind of leads her into a free fall of despair, and she's not really sure what to do. Then she gets some news from home, which means she has to travel back to her small town, and when she gets there she ends up seeing her agent, but he happens to be a ghost. I also didn't mention that he was quite handsome as well, so you can probably guess where the story is going from there, but just really loved her writing in this. Really loved, as I say, the whimsy and the magical realism in here. Obviously you've got that kind of paranormal aspect in here, and yeah, something about her writing just really captures my heart. So in terms of romance, she's definitely an Autobuy author for me. And then in terms of literary fiction, if you've been here kind of from the start of this year, you'll probably not be surprised to see this author on my list. But Frederick Bachman is fast becoming one of my favourite authors and is definitely an Autobuy author for me now. I've read 3 books by him, which I know doesn't sound a lot, but from the 3 books I've read, I've just been really awed by his writing, really felt connected with the story, and just really love his ability to tell stories that are very much character based. You know, most of his stories, if you try and tell you what the plot is, it doesn't really sound like there's going to be anything in there. This book, for instance, we've got a small town which is desolate and has been struggling for quite some time. The hockey team is about to put them back on the map because of a tournament when a horrific incident occurs, and it kind of puts that into turmoil. And when I first read the synopsis of it, I was thinking ice hockey, not interested, small town, maybe. It didn't really feel like it had much going for it, but I felt every emotion possible under the sun when I was reading this. I felt grief, despair, happiness, joy. Honestly, it's just a bit of a roller coaster of emotions, and what's interesting is that his writing is so simplistic realistic that when you first start reading, you do not think you're going to be impacted by it as much as you do. His writing's almost staccato, quite short sentences, quite simple language, it's not flowery or full of complicated prose or anything in there, but something about it is just so hard hitting. And I don't know if it's just that he's such a good character study in terms of he can really describe people, almost people that we know, and that's why I connect with it so well, and why a lot of people, I guess, connect with it so well. But yeah, something about it I just really love, and I've read 3 books by him. Bar Time was the first book. It still is my favourite book, I would say, just because of the range of emotions and how connected I felt to the characters, and really intrigued to continue the series in this one and to see where it goes with the characters in here, because as I say, you do really fall in love with them. But yeah, fast becoming a fave for me, and definitely an Autobuy author when it comes to literary fiction. Okay, so now we're going to get into the fantasy picks. So the next author I want to highlight is Rachel Gillig, and the first book I read by Rachel Gillig is One Dark Window. And if you haven't heard of this author before, I think her forte is really in kind of gothic and dark. A lot of people call it romantasy, but for me this is very much more fantasy forward. I would say the romance in the books that I've read from her are very much the subplot, and it's much more about kind of the intrigue and the plot around that romance, but the romances are done really well, so I think that is why a lot of people kind of tend to say it leans towards romantasy, but for me it is very much a subplot. So I wouldn't go into these if you're looking for romance, more so if you love kind of a gothic theme and a gothic setting with kind of dark undercurrents in there and really atmospheric settings as well, because she really is great at describing the setting and you really feel like you're there, you almost feel it. And I would say they're probably perfect kind of autumn winter reads, but you could read them any time of year. I read this in the summer, for instance, and still really loved it, but I do think it would be a perfect autumn winter read. So this was the first book I read by Rachel Gillig, but my favourite book is actually a new release and one that has just come out last month, and that book is The Night and the Moth. And honestly, this was just such an amazing book. It was one of my highest anticipated releases this year, and this has solidified her being an Autobuy author for me, actually, because I had only read the One Dark Window duet before. Really loved it, it was a 5-star series for me, but reading this has solidified that she is definitely an author that I will buy anything that she writes, because even though One Dark Window definitely does follow that gothic and dark atmosphere, I knew that I would be expecting that with this one as well, but there's actually so much humour in here, which made me see a different side to her writing as well, and really let me see her range, and that she's not kind of just a one-trick pony. There is going to be a lot more stories to tell, a lot more atmosphere. The romance in here, as I say, even though it was a subplot, was really well done, and there's a gargoyle in here that is just honestly one of the best characters I've read in a long time. So yeah, highly recommend Rachel Gillig if you love anything that's gothic, atmospheric, touch of romance in there, but plenty of plot going on around it. Especially in this one, there was a lot more plot, I would say, in The Night and the Moth than One Dark Window. One Dark Window was a bit more of a vibesy read, so there was plot there, but it was more to do with the vibes, which I loved. But if you're not a huge fan of vibes over plot, you may not enjoy that one as much as this one, but this one had plenty of plot. There was twists in there was romance, there was humour, found family, everything that you want in a perfect fantasy. So I could rave about this all day, but yeah, definitely a 5-star read for me, and again, what has solidified her as an Autobuy author for me. Okay, so next up I want to talk about Carissa Broadbent, and again, an author that I've read from and absolutely loved, and even though the books that I've read from her are actually quite different, one I would say is definitely more romantasy, so The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and then she does have another series which we will get on to, which probably leans more fantasy, so I think she has a bit of something for everyone. So even if you didn't like this series, you may like her other series. Carissa Broadbent is definitely a romantasy writer. I think a lot of people kind of put her in that group, and a lot of it is to do with the popularity of this series. You will have heard of this series. It's definitely had its day. It's definitely been quite popular, and I would definitely say for good reason. I think the writing in here is really great. I really loved kind of the character development that she has, as well as the unique world building, and she's continuing to build on this world within the rest of the series. And even though I haven't necessarily given all of her books 5 stars, I've definitely really enjoyed them, and in terms of series overall, they are definitely 5-star series for me as well. But yeah, this was the first book I read by her. If you haven't heard of this one, we're following our main character Araya, who joins in this trial basically, which is called the Kajari. If you win the Kajari, you get a wish from the goddess of death, I think it is, and essentially she wants to use this wish because she is a human who's been brought up in the vampire world, and she wants to become a vampire at the end of this. When she gets there, she meets Rain, who essentially is competing against her within these trials, but they decide to put their efforts together because only one person can win the trial, but they both want to make it to the end, so they kind of reluctantly ally together to make it to the end of these trials, and the story goes from there. Really, really good, especially if you like romantasy. Definitely think this is one you should check out if you haven't already. But I would say that the series that really solidified Carissa Broadbent as an Autobuy author for me, and the one that I actually prefer over The Serpent and the Wings of Night, is the Daughter of No World series, and within that series, my favourite book is is Children of Fallen Gods, which is actually the middle book, which is strange because a lot of series with the middle book, it kind of has middle book syndrome. But within this one, there was just such a twist within the story that I was literally gasping and couldn't put it down. I could not put it down. There was a lot of kind of reveals in here. The expansion of the world within the second book was just amazing, and yeah, really, really loved it. So Children of Fallen Gods is my favourite in that series. But if you haven't heard of Daughter of No Worlds, basically we have our main character Tisana, who has been brought up as a slave her entire life. She ends up getting freed from her captor and travels to find this kind of guild of magic within this world and wants to get their support so that she can help free the slaves from her land. And they agree to help her if they are able to use her magic for their own purposes. And as such, they put her in training with a very reluctant Maxentarius Farah Leone. And the story kind of goes from there. But I think with this one, there's just so much emotional depth. It's a lot more than a romantasy. I would say this is definitely more fantasy / political intrigue forward. So yes, the romance in here is one of my favourite that I've ever read. I really love the relationship within this one. However, romance isn't at the forefront of this story. There's plenty of it, but it's definitely not the point of the story, and there's a lot more political kind of machinations in here. You're learning about the worlds, about the politics, about the history, and as I say, in the second book it really does expand, so it's not kind of your typical romantasy in that way, because I do think it leans slightly more towards the fantasy elements within here. So just a note of caution, if it is one that you're looking into but you're much more of a romance heavy reader, this may not be what you're expecting if, you know, it is recommended as a romantasy, but just a heads up that it does have a lot more fantasy elements in here than the romance side. But in terms of the romance that is in here, perfectly done, perfectly executed, character work was perfect, and it was just one of those series that I could not guess where it was going to go in the end. So for that reason, I just think she's an incredible writer, and yeah, if she writes it, I'm going to read it. Next up, we've got Erin Morgenstern, and the first book I read by her was The Starless Sea, and it is my favourite. This is my favourite book I've read by her. I have only read 2 books by her, this one and The Night Circus, but this remains to be my favourite. And I think the main reason I love Erin Morgenstern's writing is just the elaborate and flowery, over-the-top prose. I'm a really huge lover of flowery and purple prose. Give me 10 lines about why the grass is so green. You know, I just love it. I just really, really enjoy it. I love the way they can manipulate language, and for me it just makes it a lot more transportative into the world, and I just can really feel like I'm there. I know a lot of people don't like that, so just depends on your taste, but for me personally, if I see someone has a review of a book and they say it was overly flowery or overly purple prose or anything, I'm like, add to TBR, I'm probably going to love it. So it is the main reason I love this one, but also I just really love the unique kind of concept within here. We've got a man called Zachary who basically ends up picking up this book from the library, reading through it and realising that one of the stories within there is a story about his own life when he was 10 years old. And this basically sets him on a journey to try and figure out who wrote this book, how do they know these details about him, why did they write this, why was it in his library, and why does no one have any information on it. And it's a bit of a fever dream of a book. You know, you really cannot predict where this is going to go. There's so many elements to it that I just really loved. It's fully whimsical but a really dark undercurrent in there. Great winter read. It is set more in the winter, so if you're going to read this, maybe save it for those winter months. But yeah, for me personally, just the prose in here, the writing was just so beautiful, and just everything I love when it comes to whimsical and atmospheric writing. So yeah, I don't know if she has any other books other than The Night Circus and this. I do need to look into that to see if she has some backlog or anything, but if she comes out with another book, I'll certainly be reading it. Next up, we've got an author that took me basically 2 years to read one of her series, but that is because it's around 15 or 16 books long, so it's not that it dragged or anything, there's just quite a lot of books in there, and that's Cassandra Clare, which you will all know from the Shadowhunter series, I am sure. And even though this is a really popular series, I don't actually know a lot of people who have read it kind of start to finish. I know a lot of people maybe read the first trilogy when they were younger, watched the movies, watched the TV shows, and then just haven't really revisited it. I personally didn't read it when I was younger, so I read it first time as an adult. Haven't watched the movies or the TV shows. See differing opinions on whether I should watch them, but if you've seen them, definitely let me know in the comments if you think it's something I should watch, but have really enjoyed the series. And if you haven't heard of the Shadowhunter series, basically this is following a group of people who are born with these abilities to save the world from demons, vampires, werewolves, and all those type of things. They're very much segregated from society, so us as the general public won't see them. They're brought up in a very different way from us, training basically their whole lives to fulfill this purpose. And in this first book, we've got Clary, who has been brought up as a human her entire life, never knew anything about this organisation until one day she sees 3 what she calls angels killing a demon, and the story goes from there. You can probably guess where it's going to go. You've probably heard where it goes, as this is such an old series and such a beloved series, but this was the first book I read in the series. There's differing opinions of the way you can read this series, so I read it in kind of I think it was the publication order, so I read kind of the first 3 in the Mortal Instruments, then I went back to the Infernal Devices, then to Mortal Instruments. There's a whole path you can follow, or you can read it in kind of the timeline of the characters, starting from the oldest in the story to the newest. And I decided to go with, I think, as I say, the publication order. So the first book I had to read was City of Bones, but my favourite book in the entire kind of 15 book series is Clockwork Princess. So this book is the third in the Infernal Devices series, and the Infernal Devices is technically the first chronologically when you look at the timeline, and that trilogy is probably my favourite out of all of the Shadowhunter series. I just really love the characters in there. There is a little bit of a love triangle, and what I will say about Cassandra Clare's writing is she really knows how to write a large group of characters that you get really connected with. And in terms of the romance, she is the queen of writing tension and yearning. These are YA, so there's no spice, but if you really love kind of the build up of the relationship, a bit like myself, I love a slow burn, I love the yearning, I love the angst. Cassandra Clare knows how to write that. She definitely knows how to write that. And I'm usually not a big love triangle fan, but within her books, it happens a couple of times in the series. There are a couple of times in the series where there is that kind of love triangle element, but she just does it so well that I don't mind, and I get fully invested in trying to work out who I want to be the winner or who I want as the favourite. But yeah, if I was to rank all of the kind of 15 or 16 books that are in that series overall, this would definitely be my favourite book. This last book had such an emotional impact, made me cry. I'm not really a crier when I read, but this one definitely did make me cry, especially I think it was just the epilogue in this one. Oh my god, it was so good. So yeah, I'm currently reading Swordcatcher by Cassandra Clare as well, so I'm on the second book in that series, and she's an Autobuy author for me. I love her writing, I love her worlds, I love her character work, and yeah, this would be the favourite book I've read from her so far, but we'll see. We'll see what else she brings out. The next author I want to talk about is Adeline Grace, and she is the author of the Belladonna series. So again, another kind of gothic YA. So I do love a little bit of a gothic atmosphere within my reads, so you'll probably see a bit of a theme in some of the books that I pick up. I'm kind of either really gothic or whimsical and kind of fairy tale-esque. They tend to be my favourites, so you will kind of see a theme when I'm going through these. But in this series, in the first book, we've got Signa, who as a baby loses her parents, and essentially she is kind of pushed from pillar to post with different family members throughout her life, but for one reason or another they all end up passing. She ends up going to live with her last remaining family members in their home, and ends up kind of getting embroiled in a bit of a murder mystery as her aunt had recently passed, and some clues kind of point towards it not being an accident or not being due to illness, as has been confirmed. And one thing about this is we do have a character called Death, who is essentially the embodiment of death, that has basically been around Signa for her entire life and has followed her entire life, and the story goes from there. But I do think with this one, I just think it was the perfect kind of combination of that gothic atmosphere as well as that fairy tale-esque whimsical storytelling that I love. And this was kind of set in what would probably be like a Regency, think Bridgerton type of era, but with that gothic side in there as well. Really loved the first book, but I will say that my favourite book in the series, and again the one that's kind of solidified her as an Autobuy author, was Wisteria, which is actually the final book within the series. And within this we do follow some different characters which are introduced within the series, but I would say that the books kind of follow one main couple in the first book. The second book kind of follows both interconnected. Then this third book is concentrating on a secondary couple within the series. But within each one there was kind of a bit of a mystery going on there that the characters were trying to solve. But I would say that this one had a bit more of a maybe Beauty and the Beast retelling-esque feeling or something like that. But there was just something about the setting of this one, something about the romance that I really loved, and this is definitely my favourite in the series. So if you haven't read this yet and you do want to pick it up, even if you don't love the first book, please continue, because it's definitely worth it when you get to this third book. Next up is an author that I feel really divides a lot of readers in terms of whether they enjoy her writing or don't. I feel like it's kind of like Marmite, where a lot of people really love her writing and a lot of people really hate her writing, and luckily I'm someone that really loves her writing, and that is Olivia Blake. And the first book I read from her was The Atlas Six, and I think I read this when it first kind of came out in terms of traditionally being published. I read this around that time, and it was quite different than anything I'd read before. I hadn't read a lot of dark academia before, wasn't really aware of that as a genre or subgenre, so I was really intrigued to see how I would enjoy this one. And it is quite different than a lot of the dark academia I've read before, because it does have a little bit of that magical element in there, but it's very minimal. You know, you could probably take the magic out of this story and it would still be the same story. You know, you could make their studies about anything. It wouldn't have to be the magic that's in here, because a lot of what this is kind of a character study of the students and the people that the story is following. So if you haven't heard of this one, basically this is all centered around this Alexandrian society, which every, I think it's like 10 years or something like that, invites 6 students to the academy to get access to the archives within this society and also get an opportunity to contribute to them as well. So very elite, very kind of, if you think Oxford or Cambridge, it's giving that same kind of vibe. But the main problem is that 6 recruits are taken on However, only 5 can actually be enrolled within this society, and we're kind of following them along as they try and manipulate their way through. And a lot of it, as I say, is very much more a character study, so how they react with each other, how they interact with each other, kind of their pasts, how they're connected, some of them. And I think as a series overall, I did really enjoy this. I think the first and the second book were definitely stronger than the third book. I wasn't a huge fan of the way the story ended, and I do think it was a little bit repetitive by the end, but in terms of this first book, absolutely loved it. Couldn't kind of predict where it was going to go. Really loved that character study of all the people that we're following in here. We get 6 POVs, and I think we do get a couple of Atlas Blakely, who is kind of the professor within here. I think we get a few from his perspective as well, but for the most part, we're just following the 6 students within here. But yeah, in terms of her writing, it really did intrigue me, and was definitely one of the first dark academia I read, as I say, and really kind of launched me into loving that genre, so definitely have a lot to thank this book for. But I would say that from her, my favourite book, and I probably kind of go round back and forward in this, depending on the day that I'm asked which book of hers is my favourite, because I have loved them all. But for today, the one that I'm feeling is my favourite is Masters of Death. And in this one we have a real estate agent who is basically trying to sell this house, but the only problem is that the house is actually being haunted, and the ghost will not leave the house because he was murdered. So the real estate agent ends up employing the help of this medium who is quite revered. A lot of people know about him, even though he's actually technically a fraud and doesn't really have the medium abilities that the real estate agent will need. But he does happen to be the godson of Death himself. And this story is just a bit of a calamity when I try and explain what the story is actually about. Again, that doesn't really sound like there's going to be much plot in there, but it really does expand, and it's probably another kind of fever dream when it comes to a reading experience, because maybe I'll just read the synopsis. Let's just see what it says. So the real estate agent is called Viola and the medium is called Fox, and it basically says, when Viola seeks out Fox to help her with the ghost invested mansion, he becomes inextricably involved in a quest that neither he nor Vi expects or wants. But with the help of an unruly sharp-voiced angel, a love-stricken reaper, and a few mindfulness-practicing creatures, Vi and Fox soon discover that the difference between a mysterious lost love and an annoying dead body isn't nearly as distinct as they thought. So there's just quite a few different characters that end up coming in here to play. That synopsis really is kind of tip of the iceberg about what this story ends up being about. So it's a little chaotic when you're reading it, and sometimes you're kind of thinking, what am I reading when you're reading it? But by the end, it does all tie together. Similar to her book, Gifted and Talented, I think that was exactly the same. You were kind of wondering what the point of the plot was the whole way through, but by the time you get to the end, it does make sense. And I don't know if I've managed to sell that to you, or if it probably just sounds like the worst book that's ever been written, but I really loved it. I give it 5 stars, and it's my favourite book that she's written so far, so I obviously recommend it. I would say with Olivia Blake, there's probably a book that suits everyone out there. She's written dark academia, romance, leaning fantasy, also kind of a literary fiction. This is more fantasy leaning as well. And then, as I say, Gifted and Talented, the latest one, is kind of bit of literary fiction with a tiny bit of magical realism in there as well. So I do always say, if you've read one Olivia Blake book, it does not necessarily mean you will hate her other books as well. Her writing style is so distinct and different in each of the books, but at the same time, it definitely has that Olivia Blake signature feel to it. So do with that what you will. As I say, she's very polarizing when it comes to opinions on her writing, but for me personally, I really, really love it. So again, if she writes it, I'm going to read it. Next up, we've got V.E. Schwab, and I was kind of in two minds whether to put her on this list or not, because I have only read 3 books by her as well, and she has quite a big backlog in terms of the books that she's written, and I just haven't read them yet. I do have all of them, so she is technically an Autobuy author. If she's written it, I've pretty much bought it, but I am basing that on 3 books that are 3 very different books in terms of their synopsis, and for me that is kind of the reason I think she's an Autobuy author, because she writes quite a lot of different kind of, mostly fantasy, you know, they are mostly in the fantasy genre, but in terms of the themes and the feeling and the setting of them, they're all very different, and the ones that I've read so far I've really, really loved. So for V.E. Schwab, the first book that I did read was, of course, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Much beloved. You probably have heard of this book before, and it is my favourite. It is still the favourite that I've read. Even though I've only read 3 of her books, it is still the favourite out of those 3. And definitely the one that had the most emotional impact for me. And in this one, we're following a woman from the 1700s. She's about to be the age where she needs to go and get married, going to have to settle down, and she just wants more from her life. So she makes a desperate plea to try and escape and try and kind of escape the mundanity of her current life. A demon actually answers this plea and gives her immortality. However, what it also means is that she'll never be remembered by anyone. So we kind of follow her through snippets of her life for 300 years until modern day, where she goes about life with no one remembering her not being able to make kind of connections or have relationships with anyone, because literally she'll walk in the door, she can introduce herself, but as soon as she walks out, you'll forget who she is. Until one day she meets someone who does remember her. And as I said, it's very much just kind of following her life. And I think the overall message with this one is, what is human life if it's not about connections, if it's not about kind of the people that we meet, the impact we have on them. And it's just a very emotionally heavy book, I would say, and definitely one that just really resonated with me in terms of how Addie was feeling and kind of the impact that we probably don't know that we have on other people's lives, and how much we crave that human interaction and that closeness with other humans as well. So yeah, really love this, really love the writing style of this, and this is probably the reason that I've bought basically every book that Fee Schwab has written, because of how much I love this book. And obviously her other series are very well acclaimed as well, but really it's the writing in this book that has made me think she's definitely an author for me, and pretty sure I'll be able to enjoy anything that she does write. Okay, so next up we've got Stephanie Garber, and the first book I read from her is Caraval. In this one we've got two sisters, Scarlett and Donatella, who have basically wanted to go to this carnival for their entire lives. They've written to Caraval, who is the owner of the carnival, to try and get access to it every year. One year they do get a letter back to allow them entrance, and they end up travelling to this carnival basically to try and escape their current life. When they're there, however, Donatella goes missing, so Scarlett has to embark on a quest to try and find her, and the story goes from there. And this series, I would say, is definitely more on the whimsical side. It's definitely more fairy tale feeling, and I think it just spoke to my inner child. It is a YA series, but I would say it probably leans to older YA than younger, but it definitely just spoke to my inner childhood fairy tale loving self, and just kind of scratched that itch for me when I was reading it. I do think that her writing is very, again, probably purple prose, probably a little bit flowery, and it can divide some people on that, but for me it was just perfect. I really loved the vibes of this one, and I think out of this trilogy, the second book in the series is probably my favourite, but the book that has made Stephanie Garber an Autobuy author for me would be The Ballad of Never After, which is actually part of a companion series within this Caraval world. So it is set in the same world, but it's technically after the events of Caraval. So if you're going to get into the series, you should technically read the Caraval series first, and then the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. However, you don't technically have to. There's not a lot of crossover when it comes to the characters or anything like that, apart from the very start of Once Upon a Broken Heart. So if you are going to read the Caraval series, read it first, because it will spoil it in the first book for this series. But if you're not bothered, then you can just pick up this series on its own. And in this series, we're following Evangeline, who has always believed in fairy tales and always knew that she would get her happy ever after. That is until the love of her life is actually going to marry someone else. So she makes a plea to the Prince of Hearts to stop the wedding at any cost, and he agrees to do that as long as she gives him 3 kisses of his choosing, with whom he chooses as well. The story kind of goes from there, but as I say, it's very whimsical. This one's probably even more whimsical than the Caraval series. It doesn't have as much of that dark undercurrent until maybe the third book. The third book was pretty dark, but within this series it just has that whimsy kind of feeling. As I say, spoke to my inner childhood, and this book in particular, talking about cliffhangers, so good. This had me on the edge of my seat, metaphorically, when I was reading it. I couldn't put it down. Read it so quickly. I think I read the first 2 books in this series within like 2 days. I just sped through them. Pretty quick reads, to be fair. But yeah, the way that she left us off in this one, absolutely crazy. So I can't wait for her book to come out later this year, Alchemy of Secrets. I think it's the only book that hasn't been set in this world, from my understanding anyway. But yeah, obviously she's on my auto-buy list, so that's already been pre-ordered. I haven't even read the synopsis for that one, but I just know it's going to be good, so definitely on the pre-order list. So the next author I want to talk about is Leigh Bardugo, and the first series that I read from her is Shadow and Bone. So the Grisha verse is kind of the series that she's known for. There was a TV series for this one. I don't have a physical copy of Shadow and Bone, but I do have a physical copy of my favourite book that Leigh Bardugo has written, and it is still within that Grisha verse, so it's the second book within kind of the second duology. So similar to the Shadow Hunters, there's kind of different series within the same world, but just following different characters. But my favourite book that I've read by Leigh Bardugo would be Crooked Kingdom, and this is the second in the Six of Crows duology. And if you haven't heard of Six of Crows, it's basically following a ragtag group of people who essentially group together to go on this heist in the first book to basically get this item that's going to get them kind of power and money and help them get out of the slums essentially that they're currently in. And the story goes from there. And the first book, I would say, was definitely very fast paced. We were really thrust into the story because the world had kind of been built. It was a different world to Shadow and Bone technically, but there wasn't a lot of world building that needed to be done because a lot of it was done within that first trilogy. mythology. So the first book, I think we were definitely getting a lot more of the plot and it was all kind of centered around that heist. Whereas in the second book, I do think that we got a lot more from the characters. I felt a lot more connected to them. And there's a certain thing that happens within the second book that I will never forgive her for. I will never forgive her for doing that. But I have read quite a few books by Leigh Bardugo. I've read basically most of the Grisha Farce. I've still got 2 within that world to still read. But I've also read Ninth House and Hellbent by her. Really loved those. Those are much more dark academia leading, but really loved her writing in that. I did also read The Familiar by her, which I did like, but I just think it would have been better if it had have been lengthened, if we had had more time with the characters. So I loved the writing, loved the setting, loved kind of the concept, but I felt it was rushed. Or it felt rushed to me in terms of the plot. So technically it wasn't a 5-star or anything, but still really loved her writing in that. So hasn't kind of discouraged me from picking up any of her new releases. So again, probably an author that if she brought out a new book, I probably wouldn't even need to read the synopsis. I would just pick it up. Sorry if the angle has changed slightly. I had to change my SD card and now I'm concerned about how long this video is going to be because I've obviously been yabbering on for a very long time. But the next author I want to talk about is R.F. Kuang, and the first book I read by her is Babel or Babel, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And this book was so impactful. I think it's definitely a dark academia, but it's so much more than that. It's definitely a lot of social commentary around racism, unconscious bias, trust that, you know, within history, if something has been relayed from maybe Indigenous people or from people from another land, that white people may have misconstrued it, or we really have a trust in that the translation is keeping the meaning of the original text and it hasn't been manipulated. And there was just so much nuance within this that honestly it takes a while to unpack. And it's one of those books that I read that did make me feel a little bit uncomfortable while reading it, but in a really good way, because it really made me question some of the things that maybe I've thought about, or maybe some things that I've maybe seen in society or seen within this world and maybe just not questioned because of kind of the unconscious biases that we do have as society. And it was just so well done to be wrapped into kind of this story about this historic university. Basically, I think it's Oxford within this. Yes, it's Oxford, and essentially we have these students who go to study language and kind of the magic surrounding it. There's these silver bars that basically can be inscribed, and these are essentially running the country. And one of the main characters is actually an orphan from Canton who was basically cherry picked from that area and taken back to England, essentially to go and study this art and have this talent. And there's just so much nuance in here that if you haven't read this, definitely pick it up. It does seem a little bit intimidating at the start because there's a lot of footnotes, there's quite a lot of commentary around, I suppose, the resources that she used to build this story. But what I would say is that I used the audiobook for this one and it definitely helped with the flow of the story, because I feel like if I read this physically I might have got drawn out of the story by having to kind of go to the footnotes and back to the reading just because they're so involved. So I would highly recommend maybe listening to the audiobook while also reading this one as well. But really love this one. But when it comes to my favourite read from R.F. Kuang, I would have to say it's The Burning God, and that's the 3rd book within the Poppy War series. And it's quite difficult to kind of compare obviously feelings around my favourite book from an author when you're comparing a standalone to a series, because obviously by this book I love the characters in here, I love the story that's been told, I love the world. So it's maybe not a fair comparison when I'm looking at some of these authors to say that the 3rd within a series was my favourite book, but if I am looking at it objectively, this was my favourite book. I loved the conclusion to this series, and this one is definitely not an easy read. We're following a young girl at the start of the story who is about to be married off at a very young age because she lives with her aunt and uncle, but they basically don't take great care of her, they're quite abusive, and they just want to get the money for her through this marriage. She makes a deal with them that if she can get into this military school called Syndergaard, that she will not have to marry this man and can kind of go on and become a warrior within the military. And she manages to get in. So at the start of the story we're following her journey through that academy. But I do have to point out this is quite a hard-hitting series in terms of it is quite dark, and it's not one that you're necessarily going to get a happy ending based on some real events and some real wars as well. So a lot of this is kind of sprinkled with real history. There is a little bit of magic in here, which is what makes it kind of a fantasy series in terms of the powers that the warriors have. But I definitely think what this does is really highlights the atrocities of war, the atrocities of humankind, and we're following our main character Rin along the entire journey, and for the most part you can kind of see her descending into almost craziness, and you may not necessarily agree with all the decisions that she's making at the time, but because you love her so much and because you're kind of in her head, you're almost justifying her actions to yourself, and you can kind of see her side even though objectively you know it's wrong. The way the book's written, you do end up agreeing with her along along the way. It was just such a great story. Loved the way it was concluded. I think it was really real. It was very raw, definitely unexpected, but at the same time just such a great conclusion that I honestly couldn't see it ending any other way. So yeah, really loved the series overall, but this third book definitely tugged at my heartstrings, so I would have to say this is the favourite book I've read by her. Okay, we're down to the last three, and these are three authors that you will have heard me yapping about before, but the first author I want to highlight is obviously my fave, Saba Tahir, and this is the first book I read by her, so An Ember in the Ashes, and this series just changed my brain chemistry, definitely made me realise what I love about fantasy, what I love about kind of romantic fantasy, and really kind of set the tone in terms of storytelling and the types of stories I like to read. Absolutely love this series. Within this, we're following a world that is kind of under the Marshall Empire, but within this world we do also have what are called scholars, who are basically living in the slums and the poorer side of this land. One of the scholars is a girl called Leia, and at the start of the story her brother is actually arrested in connection with the rebellion that has been going on against this Marshall Empire. So she ends up taking the journey to the Marshall Empire to try and free him, and while she's there she meets Elias, who has been training as part of this Marshall Empire for his entire life to become what is known as a mask, so basically a warrior within this empire. However, he does have kind of conflicting feelings about whether he should be doing this and whether he agrees with the Marshall Empire. Him and Leia actually reluctantly ally together to try and meet their common goals, essentially. And honestly, that does it such a disservice in terms of describing what the story is actually about and how it made me feel. But let's just say Saba Tahir knows how to tell a story, she knows how to build characters, she knows how to break your heart, and she really puts her characters through the ringer. And the character development in here is probably some of the best I've seen in any story. There's definitely characters in here that at the start you can't see why you would ever like them. By the end, you're probably going to love them. So definitely one of the best series I've ever read. But in terms of my favourite book within that series and my favourite book from Saba Tahir, I would probably say that the last book in the series was my favourite. Just the way that it tied up and kind of seeing the conclusion for all of these characters that I'd grown to love so much and really loved following their story. I would have to say it probably is my favourite book, even though it is quite heartbreaking at times. It's still my favourite in the series. So once again, if you haven't read this series, definitely go and read it. One of my favourites of all time. Cannot recommend Saba Tahir's writing enough. Then next up, I would be remiss not to mention Sarah J. Maas. I absolutely love her. She is one of my favourite authors. Loved all the series that she's written. I've reread them multiple times, and the first book I read from her is, of course, A Court of Thorns and Roses. And it's so funny because back when I read this, I don't think anyone had really heard of it outside of kind of maybe the Bookstagram or BookTube community, because when I picked it up I didn't know anybody else who had read it, so I had no one to talk to about it when I read it. But now obviously being part of Bookstagram, being part of BookTube, no one shuts up about this one, so I probably don't need to tell you what this one's about, but it's essentially a bit of a Beauty and the Beast retelling in this first book. We're following Feyre, who is really struggling with her family. They've been poor for quite some time, and she essentially is out hunting, trying to get them food to eat. She ends up killing a wolf while she's out hunting, who actually turns out to be a Fey soldier, and basically that sparks off the High Lord of the Spring Court coming to visit her and basically taking her to his land as reparation for killing one of his soldiers. The story goes from there. It really expands from there, but that's kind of the premise of this first book. And I will say, when I first read this first book, I wasn't fully kind of enamoured by the story. I did really enjoy it, but I think in true SJM fashion, it was only really the last 100 pages that got me really hooked on the series, and then I read on the series. The rest is history. I ended up getting obsessed with all of the series that she's written. But I will say that out of all the books that she's written, out of all the series, my favourite book is still within this series, and that is A Court of Silver Flames, which is kind of the last book that she brought out within the series. And I can't really give you a synopsis for this because it will give spoilers for the rest of the ACOTAR series, so if you haven't read it, it will spoil it. But let's just say the two characters that are on the cover here, I can't get enough of them. I absolutely love them. Absolutely obsessed with their love story. Obsessed with the female character. She's quite a complex character. Again, quite a divisive character. A lot of people don't like her, and I think I can understand why. If you read the series, you'll understand why a lot of people don't like her, but the character development, again, that you get in this book is so good, so satisfying, especially when you see where she comes from at the start of the books. And yeah, just absolutely love this. So even out of all the books I've read by SJM, I think again there's around 16 books overall in all of her series. This is definitely still my favourite. And then last but certainly not least, we've got an author who you'll have heard me talk about. In fact, she was spoken about in 2 videos ago with my summer recommendations, and I'm not going to spend much time talking about the book because you've heard it all before, but it's Laini Taylor. And the first book I read from her was Strange the Dreamer, and that's still my favourite. I love this duology, but I would say that the first book within the duology is still my favourite, especially, I mean, just read the prologue of this book. If you're not enthralled by that, then maybe this isn't the book for you. But the prologue within this had me gripped straight away. Within the first kind of 3 paragraphs, I had to read on. I had to know what happened to get us to that point. Again, I have to point out Laini Taylor's writing is very flowery, is very purple prose. So if that's not something you like, she may not be the writer for you. But for me, I just love this duology. I think it had the perfect kind of mix of fantasy, whimsy, romance, political intrigue. There was just everything in there that I love within a story. And in terms of shock factor, you just never knew where the story was going to go. Probably one of my favourite books ever that I've ever read, so do with that what you will. But because of this book, essentially, I will read anything that Laini Taylor writes. I have read her Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, really loved it as well. So yeah, just everything about her writing is perfection to me, so she's very, very solidly on my Autobuy author list. Okay, so that's everything. If you're still here, you've probably had to take several breaks going through that. I feel like this is going to be a pretty long one, or at least I've been sitting here yapping for quite a long time. I may cut some of it out. Those are my 15 Autobuy authors, and the first and the favourite book that I've read by them. Definitely let me know your Autobuy authors in the comments below. I'd love to get some new authors to try out, and especially if they're kind of literary fiction, romance, or maybe something outside of the fantasy genre. I think I've got plenty within that genre to keep me occupied, but I am trying to branch out a little bit. So if you think there's something a little bit different that I would probably like just based on my taste with these Autobuy authors, definitely let me know in the comments below. And if you've made it this far in the video and you don't have an Autobuy author that you want to add, just leave me a heart emoji in the comments to let me know that you've made it this far. And if you like this video, do remember to give it a like, and if you want to see more from me, remember to subscribe. I post 2 videos per week, and it's videos like this, so book recommendation videos, reading vlogs, TBR jars, all good bookish things like that. Other than that, thanks so much for watching this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one soon. Bye!